addresses to specialized audiences, and it tends to be an internal dialogue. It tends to be people who think very technically about certain issues, and sometimes I go into court and have to present these same kinds of questions in a very distilled fashion. And it's a real opportunity to come and speak to an audience that is not at a law school, not in a courtroom, that is people who are concerned about the basic ideas of our society. And it's humbling and disciplining on me, because it means I have to think, how do you engage these issues at a very deep yet fundamental level? I want to begin this evening by describing, in somewhat Sherlock Holmes fashion, a group of Americans that has gone missing. And they're probably folks that you may have heard of from time to time. They used to be more prevalent in this country, and nowadays you tend to see them only every 4 years or so. And they tend to exist primarily in focus groups of TV studios. Otherwise, they've largely disappeared. Maybe you know someone in your community who fits the bill, but maybe not. And that's the missing group of the undecided voter. Those people, they come together every 4 years, they give interviews in the TV studios, and they say, I just don't know, I can't make up my mind, it's all so confusing. And we sit there and we enjoy it, and after a while we start thinking, who are these people? How can they not know? They've been bombarded with ads every minute of every day, and they don't. These are the people who are still traumatized by, is it less filling? Does it taste great? They're still working through these big issues of our time, and they're wondering, how can it be that I'm supposed to decide the presidency? Now, for much of the 20th century, our political science, our political theory, has thought that these are the critical people in every election. And this was an important insight, and it was an important way of organizing our politics. And it had a deep theory to it that actually goes back to the writings of an economist 85 years ago, a man by the name of Harold Hotelman, who's known only in very technical economic circles, but who's actually had a great insight. And the insight was the following. 1929, it was the beginning of the really mass production of automobiles. There were starting to be cars all over America. And with cars, you need filling stations. And Hotelling was puzzled by something that may seem obvious to us now, but it's actually kind of an interesting problem. So if you had a town that was a mile long, and you had one filling station, it would be in the center of town. That would be what economists call the efficient equilibrium. That would be the obvious place where it couldn't get better, nobody could get closer, that's the best place to put it. And then he said, however, if you had two filling stations, one should be a quarter mile into town and one should be a quarter mile in from the other direction. Because that way, nobody would ever have to drive more than a quarter mile to get to a filling station. That's the most efficient distribution of the two gas stations. And then he had a moment that economists rarely have, where he said, wait a second, what about reality? Not just the model. And the reality is, as we all know it, if there's two filling stations in town, where are they? Yeah, they're across the street from each other, right? They're right smack in the center someplace, and they're right across the street from each other. So that's a little bit of a puzzle. Why are they there? And Hotelling said, I know why. He said, because if I set up at the 25% line, let's call it the 25-yard line, let's use the football analogy so it's easy. If I set up at the 25-yard line, the other guy should set up at the other 25-yard line over there, but he's going to cheat, and he's going to set up at my 30-yard line so that he has 70% of the market and I only get 30% of the market. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move over to the 35-yard line, and then he's going to move over to the 40-yard line. This is a world that, again, it's an economist world. It's a world called no transaction costs, right? So you can do this endlessly. So you move and you move and you move, and finally, what's the outcome? They're right in the middle. They're just looking at each other. And then a man named Anthony Downs, a political scientist, said, you know, politics actually has a feature very much like this. And the feature is that any time you have what's called a single peaked election, that means only one person wins. It's not proportional representation, so it's not multiple winners, it's just one. There's going to be pressure toward two and only two parties. Because every time somebody splits off, it leaves more votes for one of the parties, and since it's a plurality system, that just basically gives the election to the other side. So the Downsian insight, as it's called, is that you're going to have two parties, and they're going to behave like the filling stations. They're going to start trying to figure out how they can get a little bit more of the vote, because they want to be the winner. And when they get it wrong, and they go too far to the 25-yard lines on either side, then we have a name for that. We call it Barry Goldwater. We call it George McGovern, right? We call it losing. And so what you want to do if you're in politics, and here's something that in Robert Byrd's state I should not have to say, but you want to win. And so you don't want to lose. And that's the best way to win, by the way, is by not losing. But so what you want to do is you want to figure out how you're going to grab more of the turf than your rival. And so long as we assume that the turf is all the voters, then we're playing to that person in the middle. And this is what's called median voter theory. This was the idea that what drives politics is the center, and that's where you really want to be. And that's why the TV studios are still desperately searching for the undecided voter. Because in our theory, in the way we've understood politics, and in the way the parties have behaved for a century, the understanding is that you got to capture the middle, otherwise you're going to be Barry Goldwater or George McGovern. Well, now, what happens if that 100%, that universe, is not really a universe? It's a subset. Then all of a sudden, you're not quite sure that the median voter is actually driving the results. And so imagine that the electorate itself is changed, that the electorate itself is up for grabs. Not just who's in the center, but who's going to vote. So in 2008, presidential year, 62% of American eligible voters voted. In 2010, a non-presidential year, 42% voted. In 2012, presidential year, 58% voted. In 2014, just now, about 37% voted. So between 2008 presidential and 2014 non-presidential, that's a 25 percentage point drop off. Right? So it's a different electorate. And I can tell you that in 2012, from working inside one of the campaigns and being friends with some of the main lawyers in the Romney campaign as well, that both parties went into that campaign with one understanding. If it's the electorate of 2008, Obama wins. If it's the electorate of 2010, it's time for President Romney. That was the decisive issue in 2012. And we can draw certain distinctions. When 62% vote, President Obama cleans house. When 42% vote, the Republicans drive out the Democrats. When 58% vote, President Obama is reelected. When 37% vote, the Republicans sweep. Okay? Well, now all of a sudden, if I'm a political operative, if I'm a candidate, if I'm a political party, I'm not thinking about the median voter. I'm not thinking about this person in the middle. I'm not trying to be a filling station in the center of town. I'm worried who's going to turn out. And how do you get them to turn out? You need money, you need volunteers, you need yard signs, and nowadays you need an incredible technological array. You have smartphones and you know everything about everybody you're going to visit. What they subscribe to, what kind of car they drive, what party they're registered. It's incredible the amount of information we have in these campaigns and the ability to predict how people are going to behave in the elections. And so the modern wisdom is turnout is key. Now, who gives money? Who puts in the time on the campaign? Who does the door-to-door? Who does the work of getting a candidate over the hurdle? It turns out it's not those people in the focus group who are still, oh my God, I can't decide. Those people don't do anything. Those people, if they get to the polls, good for them, right? But that's about it. Who is active? Who drives it? Who drives this train? It's the people who are really committed, ideologically committed. And those tend to be from the polls and not from the center. So now we have an impetus toward our elections being run by campaigns that are organized, controlled, financed by the 25%, by the 25-yard lines, and not at the 50-yard line. And so it changes. And it means that different candidates get elected, campaigns are run differently, our politics looks different. It also means that just the act of casting the ballot is now a highly charged partisan issue, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. And it's not just that it's partisan by itself, who votes. It's partisan in that it ties into the increased polarization of the parties. They're more polarized than they've been in the last 100 years. It ties into the polarization of Congress. For the first time in a very long time, we have no Democratic member of Congress who's more conservative than the Republican member of Congress, and no Republican member of Congress who's more liberal than a single Democratic member of Congress. We have a separation of parties, something that began with the realignment after the Civil Rights Movement, when the South became not Democratic but Republican, but it is consolidated now. We have more polarization of the population. We have a sorting of the population. People tend to live in communities where there's more people like them. They tend to get information in ways that are not like our halcyon days of Walter Cronkite being the voice of America for everyone. But now there's multiple sources of information, which is wonderful in some ways and also problematic in other ways. So I want to talk about where we are right now. And I'm going to suggest to you that there's a couple of issues that may have actually reached the point of crisis in the governance of our electoral system. I want to talk about some of the sources of it and then some of the things that might be done to address them. So what are the crises? And I say this not in the spirit of crisis mongering, but in the spirit of a favorite political theorist of mine, Rahm Emanuel, whose belief was that you never let a good crisis go to waste, right? This is an opportunity. So one is that there's a sense of discomfort about public administration in this country, and in particular about the election system. We're not sure it works very well. We just had a presidential commission that tried to figure out why people were in line for so long. Why is it so hard in so many places to cast a ballot? I had some role in advising the chairs of it. The chairs of it were the main campaign lawyer for the Obama campaign, the main campaign lawyer for the Romney campaign, Bob Bauer and Ben Ginsberg. And the question that I wanted to address was, we move people along where there's a payout for it. So let's get some of those folks to help us design a better election system. So we got, for example, the vice president of Disney. If there's anybody who knows how to move people through a line, it's Disney. Why can't we harness that talent? And they help. These big companies help. The person from Disney was very helpful, although he was struck by one very odd thing that he couldn't quite understand. How can you have so many people in line and not sell them anything, right? It's the obvious thing to do. But we believe that there's something more than just the lines. There's something sinister there. And so there is a strong belief among Republicans in the United States that there is a great deal of election fraud in this country. In personam voter fraud. People go, they pretend to be somebody else, and they vote. And that may be tipping elections. Extraordinarily difficult way to tip an election, by the way. most elections are decided by the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. You've got to spend a lot of time really fast going around from place to place to think you're going to make a difference that way. But there's a corresponding strong belief among Democrats that there's a lot of vote suppression out there, that there's a lot of people being kept from voting, and in particular that there's new proposed legislation in many parts of the country that's tipping the outcome of elections. The difficulty for both of these views is that there's no empirical support for either. There is basically no evidence that we've been able to find, that anybody's been able to find, of in personam vote fraud. It just doesn't happen. It's a stupid thing to do. You get arrested, you go to jail, and you're not going to make any difference anyway. There's also not much voter suppression either. There's a lot of concern about it, but the evidence just isn't there. And the reality is that if you really want to ratchet up voter ID requirements and things like that, the people that you're going to keep from voting are people who already don't vote. In 2014, 37% of voters turned out. You think those are people who don't have a driver's license, who don't have any kind of ID, don't have a relation to the society? That's not who doesn't have these kinds of credentials. So that in some sense, West Virginia is quite characteristic. West Virginia in 2014, consistent with the national trend, flipped entirely onto the Republican side of the ledger. But there were no meaningful voter reforms. There was a slight change in your early voting requirements, but nothing significant, nothing certainly draconian. And you got what you got. So there's not much support for this. There's actually a very nice piece in the New York Times this morning that sets out why this is and why the data is very complicated, that tries to make the contrary. There's a second crisis, and that is that through much of our history in the 20th century, when we established the right to vote as a fundamental right of American citizens, we policed against some of the worst excesses of our political process through the singular prism of race. Now, this is a troubling issue. The majority of our cases, when you think, especially some of you are high school students, and you think about a phrase I'm sure you've heard, one person, one vote, right? That's got to be the bedrock. Every citizen is treated equally. Everyone has the right to vote. Where did that come from? It's certainly not in our Constitution. It came from a Supreme Court case in the 1960s, a case called Reynolds versus Sims. It was a case from Alabama. And it was a case that basically was a way in which Jim Crow was maintaining control by not having equal representation of the cities where there were people of color who were able to vote for the first time. And so you look back at our history, and we've dealt with it. We've dealt with most of the questions about our political process as a race question. Now, until the 20th century, racial minorities, blacks in particular, were not the most excluded group. The most excluded group was women, right? And women had a brief period where they had the franchise in some places. Oddly, they lost it. There was, for example, women in the post-colonial period were allowed to vote in New Jersey. There was a proposal put up in New Jersey to reconsider that. And the argument was made that if we let women vote, we'll have to let black people vote. And overwhelmingly, the franchise was repealed for women, including with women supporting it. And you think, first of all, that's a really bad argument on every level. It doesn't follow that you should, and you should. But beside that, why did they vote for it? Anyway, in the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, we passed a constitutional amendment, we extended the franchise to women, and that was one of the most remarkable legal transformations in American history because it required no adjudication. The Constitution was changed, it became a fact, it was done. Didn't happen with blacks. And so the question of the African American franchise has been the central piece through which we've tried to make sure that our political system's tolerable. And that's a horrible outcome because it means we put our democratic aspirations on the shoulders of our most vulnerable citizens. And one of the big questions for today is how long that can continue. So the third crisis is one that I don't want to spend time on because it's a whole different topic, but it's also, we think that as a result of the polarization, as a result of the poor administration, as a result of this chaotic way of handling our political process, that it's not doing a very good job, right? You know, I moved, I'm foreign born. I moved to the United States when I was a young boy, and then I moved when I was 7 years old to New York City. At that time, the big thing in New York City, this is the 1960s, the big thing in New York City was that after nearly 40 years, they were going to finish the Second Avenue subway. I moved back to New York City in 1999 from Texas. And the big thing in New York in 1999 was that they were finally going to finish the Second Avenue subway. Let me tell you, it's not done. It's just a big hole in the ground on Second Avenue to this day. And that's just unbelievable. 100 years to build a subway line. So why does this come about? Let me say a couple things about that before I move on to how we should think about it. Well, first of all, the United States has something very strange that no other democratic country has. We let partisan officials run our election system. Seems obvious to us, right? Secretary of State runs for office, we elect Secretary of State, Secretary of State's, you know, when we had the Florida election in 2000, the big Bush v. Gore campaign, the head of the Bush campaign was the Secretary of State who was counting the ballots. The head of the Gore campaign was the Attorney General who was in charge of making the legal rulings on anything that came up as an election contest. You know, maybe in some crazy way that balanced out, but that seems a cockamamie way to run an election system, that you let the people whose jobs are at stake be in charge of the process. So in Europe, for example, the European Union has something called the Venice Commission. The Venice Commission is actually a very good operation. It advises new democracies on how to run their democratic systems. You know, you have the former Soviet republics and all. One of the first things they do is they say, you must have independent electoral administration. Independent. You can't let anybody monkey around with the voting rules because that's too corrosive to a democracy. We don't have that. Second, we have something very odd in this country. We have a constitution that doesn't speak about democracy. The word democracy never appears in our Constitution. The right to vote never appears in our Constitution. The political process doesn't appear in our Constitution. How do you elect Congress? From each congressional district, right? Not so for the first 50 years. Until 1842, we did it any number of ways. It's not in the Constitution. And this is not an accident, because our Constitution has an original sin to it. And the original sin of the American Constitution was slavery. And because there was a concern about maintaining a union of slave and free states, the constitutional compromise was you can't allow the federal government any power over the internal life of the states, including their political processes. So we had the 3/5 compromise. We have the idea that you have a census and you apportion, but everything that goes on inside the states was their business. Our Constitution was silent. So that a case like Reynolds versus Sims out of Alabama that says one person, one vote, that was a judicial creation. That was almost 200 years into our constitutional history before we started to define what the parameters of democratic participation were. And then we have certain practices in this country which make things a little bit worse. We debate how bad they are. And that is, we let people run the political system to their own advantage. We have things like gerrymandering. Can you imagine advising somebody, you say, what do you want to do when you set up a new political system and you're going to have districts? Well, let the people who are the insiders manipulate this in some way that's not transparent to anybody so that they can feather their own nest for as long as possible and never face a contested election. It's a great idea, great idea. And, you know, there was a period in the 1980s and 90s where the United States Congress had let, not the 90s, 1980s, You'll see why. The United States Congress in the 1980s had less turnover than the Soviet Politburo, right? So that we were an inferior institution in terms of responsiveness. At least when they screwed up, they got their heads cut off or whatever, and that was the end of it. But somebody new came in. Ours never left. They were there. They were there forever. There was a statistic from the first part of the 21st century that in, I think it was a 5-year period, there was more turnover among the hereditary heads of state of the European monarchies than there was in the American Congress, right? This is an insane system. We're kind of stuck with it. So what do we do about all this? Well, as I said, for a lot of time, we tried to get at this through a question of race. And we tried to say the key thing about our democracy is it has a vulnerability to discrimination. And so we litigated, and I spent a lot of years litigating cases that had to do with, first of all, just getting black people to be able to register to vote. Those were mostly done before I came along, but there were still some done. But then we discovered that some of the mechanisms that we used in this country that we adopted in the early part of the 20th century, the Jim Crow period, but we also adopted them in the North, made it very hard for minorities to get represented. And then all of a sudden, we found things like at-large elections. So if you have a city council, if you vote by district, a minority is going to get somebody on the city council. But if you give everybody 5 votes for 5 seats, what that means is that the majority is going to control all 5. A 60-40 majority could get 5 seats in at-large, and probably they'll only get 3 or 4 if it's broken up by districts. So we had to litigate against that. And what happened as a result of that was unforeseen. Because when we broke up the legacy of Jim Crow, the formal exclusion of black citizens in the South, there was another group that benefited, that profited, that rose to the fore, and that was Republicans. So for the first time since Reconstruction, in state after state of the South, you had Republicans coming into office. You had a realignment. The Republicans became a more conservative party. The Democrats became the pro-civil rights party. It was a complete inversion, right? It used to be the party of Lincoln and the party of Jim Crow. It turned around. And then we had a problem in our court system. And it turns out that our court system was unable to address how race interacts with politics. So that all of our cases about black voting rights that so transformed the South were cases where we were in the all-Democratic state of Mississippi. We were in the all-Democratic state of Alabama. Or sometimes we were in the all-Democratic city of Chicago. Or we were in the all-Democratic city of New York. I mean, these were great cases, but they never had to engage what happens if you have bipartisan competition. What happens if you have an overlay of race and politics. These were cases exclusively about race. And so then when the Republicans started to be active, and then you had cases that began to press the question of what's the relationship between race and the racial exclusion and the political preferences, the Supreme Court said, we don't know what to do with that. And the first time they confronted it was a case out of Indianapolis, where they had to deal with the fact that there were what we call multi-member districts, at-large elections basically, and there was a part of the city which the court's opinion refers to as the Negro ghetto. And it says the Negro ghetto is where the Negroes live in close proximity. You know, is the Supreme Court trying to figure out what everybody understands to be racial exclusion? They were trying to grapple with it. And there was a claim that all the other surrounding areas voted Republican, and they were heavily white. And the black part of town voted Democratic, and they got no representation. And the court said, well, you know, they could get representation if they voted Republican, right? And, you know, this is, it's a hard question. I mean, it's actually one of the great, if you think about it, it's one of the great advantages of the old Soviet Union, is that everybody got to vote. In fact, everybody had to vote. and everybody got to vote for the winner, right? And so we had an offer. You too can vote for the winner. It may not be the one you want to vote for, but you can have that too. Well, this is actually a hard question. The Supreme Court doesn't know what to do with that, and we don't know what to do with it now. So for example, consider the following shocking fact. Over 90% of black citizens in Mississippi today vote Democratic. It's almost 96%. Over 90% of white citizens in Mississippi vote Republican. What are you going to say about that? Is that a racial vote? Is that a partisan vote? Does it make any sense to try to disentangle the two? So we have, at this moment, a political, legal, constitutional land shift. And the shift is that the Civil Rights Acts, the Voting Rights Act in particular, is weaker than it has been. Some people like myself believe it hasn't really been very functional for quite some time. It hasn't played that big a role. But the question that's put forward by reformers now is, what should we do about all these problems I've been describing? And many people say, we need to beef up the civil rights laws. We need to get back into the discrimination model. And I want to conclude by suggesting two things that maybe this is not the right way to think about it. And so let's go back to the question of all the reforms. You've all read about these, right? That there are voter ID requirements, that there's curtailment of early voting, that North Carolina won't pre-register high school seniors anymore. There's disputes about this all over the country. And disputes that have been in the courts, and they're heavily litigated, and the landscape is changing from day to day. And they're litigated in two different ways. One is to say this is racial discrimination. And in some places, it certainly has the legacy effect of that. North Carolina was a Jim Crow state. Certainly Texas has a very strong history of racial discrimination. And so it looks like a form of exclusion. It looks like it goes back to the oldest form of exclusion, where you just can't vote. Problem is that the state that experimented most heavily initially with these reforms, these voter registration reforms, was Kansas. Kansas does not have a significant minority population. Kansas, this is not a racial issue. And the reason that Kansas did this is that Kansas is a Republican state. And if you follow the election results, you see that the more people that vote, Democrats do better. Fewer people that vote, Republicans do better. Not always, by the way. 2006, the Democrats cleaned house against the demoralized Republican Party, and that was low turnout. That was a low turnout year. But that's the conventional wisdom now. And the only thing that separates the states that have had reforms to make voting more difficult from those that have not, and I'm not trying to be partisan, this is just absolutely a description, is if the Republicans control the governorship and the legislature, there are voting reforms. If the Democrats control it, basically there are not. There's a couple of exceptions either direction, but that's basically the divide. So what should we do about that? Well, we could try to reinvigorate the race question. Right? We could say, aha, the Republicans are doing this for racial reasons, and we want to brandish the language of racism and discrimination into this. That's a toxic concept. Undoubtedly, it's true in some instances. Undoubtedly, it has elements of motivation in some places. I don't want to dispute that. But why do we want to force it into the category of race? Why do we want to, once again, take a weakness of our democratic constitutional system and put it on the shoulders of black citizens, Hispanic citizens, minorities, and say, it's yours to carry the strength of our democracy by fighting against discrimination against you. This is not discrimination against you. This is a structural defect of our system. So let me offer you a different way to think about this. So it turns out that there was a Supreme Court case of a year and a half ago or so that received much less attention than the Shelby County case, which is the case that involved the constitutionality of some parts of the Voting Rights Act. And that was a case out of Arizona. And that was a case in which the state of Arizona wanted to ratchet up, I made a mess of my notes, I always do this, but anyway. I'm done. Oh, no. The state of Arizona wanted to ratchet up the forms that you have to fill out to register to vote. You have to show proof of citizenship. It turns out, for federal elections, the federal government, Congress, has passed a law that says this is how you register to vote. And so it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, hey, wait a second. This is not a discrimination issue. This doesn't fall, as we describe it in the constitutional terms, under the 14th or 15th Amendment. This is what's called the Elections Clause. This is Article 1 of the Constitution. This is an affirmative grant of power to Congress. Congress has the right to set the time, place, and manner of federal elections. Period. It's right in the Constitution. It's one of the few things dealing with elections. It's in the Constitution itself, the original Constitution. And so what the court said was, when Congress acts on federal elections, there's no issue about whether you prove discrimination. There's no issue about whether you've done enough to establish that minorities need to be protected in this fashion. It's just federal legislation. And that was the end of it. There's challenges here and there, but that was the end of that. And what that does is it suggests that you can get at this problem by thinking in slightly different ways. If the problem is systemic and not animus-driven, not driven by hostility, hatred, venom, discrimination, then perhaps the time has come to shift over to thinking about it as a systemic matter. And so what could Congress do? Well, Congress, this is where we get into the hypothetical part of the discussion, because this assumes a credible congressional response, a willingness to address issues. But, there have been bad moments before, and we get over them. And so at some point, you have to start proposing sensible things, and you're going to get sensible people trying to govern. And so what would an institutional solution look like? Well, you just say, here's the deal, folks. Here's the rule for federal elections. You can vote early this many times. And by the way, before you get anybody gets on a high horse about, they're cutting early voting in Ohio, they're cutting early voting in North Carolina. I come from New York. We have 0 early voting. We have the most regressive election laws in the country, the worst. They're Byzantine, they're hard to maneuver. You can't vote early, you can't do no excuse absentee, you can't do any of that. No mail-in, nothing. Oregon, 100% mail-in. Right? California's thing is going 100% mail-in. Last presidential election, about 1/3 of the American population voted before election day. Make it easy. People work. They have jobs. It's hard to vote on election day. So how would Congress go about doing this? They would have to break from the idea that this is a racial issue. They would have to say, this is just a matter of our administration. And let me give you an example. The original Constitution requires that the federal government do a census every 10 years. Before 1789, the states did their own census. This was a custom from the British, that they would do the census for the British authorities in order to set their taxation rates. And one of the shocking things after 1776 was we discovered there were about 4 times as many people living in the United States as had ever been reported. Obviously, if you're just reporting to pay taxes, you report very little. So we came up with this brilliant scheme that you pay taxes and you get representation based upon the same numbers. And now all of a sudden it cuts both ways. But the states still had incentives to do their internal affairs on a different basis. The federal government did not prohibit them from doing that. The federal government just said, fine, we'll do census every 10 years as required. You know what? States stopped doing censuses. Why? It was expensive, it was duplicative, there was nothing to be gained from it. And the federal standard became the standard for everything. No state does its own census anymore. If you run federal elections in a way that is sensible, that is organized to get this across, make it possible for people to vote, if you set up standards that can be used across the country, including better machines, money for machines, things of that sort, then all of a sudden, the states may try to have a second election for the state officials on a different basis. But that's going to go the way of the independent state census. Who among citizens of a state are going to say, we think that the best thing to do with our limited tax resources is to run two different election systems with a lot of confusion among the people who have to administer it and a lot of dissatisfaction among the voters. Oh, well, the last time I voted, I brought this. No, but this is a different election. You have to bring something else. But Mary, I come every year. You know me. We live next to each other. Oh, sorry, can't vote here. People don't put up with that. That's just not going to happen. It also addresses one of the worst parts of the American system, which is when you have control made at the local level, county level, or even at the state level, you don't internalize the cost of your decisions. Why? Because all of a sudden, you can tip a federal election, right? So that the decisions that were made about how you count Chads and those perforated ballots in Florida in 2000, those were decisions about who would be president for all of us. And so you want to have some control over this so that local officials don't think, aha, this is my chance, right? You know, remember the 1960 election where Mayor Daley controlled in Chicago and Lyndon Johnson controlled Texas. And, you know, we all love JFK in retrospect and all that, but it's not so clear that he won that election. And, you know, you have to worry about these, the ability to manipulate the local election rules, especially when it affects national elections. So the conclusion is actually a little bit broader, and I'm just going to hint at it and stop. And that is something about the universal versus the particular. It's something about the general versus the specific. We have handled most of the questions about the integrity of our democratic process in the 20th century by looking at who is most vulnerable and by trying to do something for them. And I think it's been a heroic effort. The elections in the United States, the political system, looks nothing like what it did, right? When I started litigating voting rights cases and I got out of law school in the 1980s, there were very few black elected officials in the country, very few. Now there's any number of them, including in the White House. It's a different transformed environment. And so the question is whether you start thinking about the remaining problems, which I suggest to you are largely the product of rational people making calculated decisions about how they will be better off in the election system. Partisan advantage is you know, it's the nuts and bolts, it's the driving element of our democratic system. Democratic competition is great. They should want to win. They have to want to win. They have to think it makes a difference. But they will always be tempted at the election time to go a little bit too far, to try to change the rules, to bend the rules. That's why you need administration to rein that in, to make sure that the elections are contests about ideas, are contests about power, and not contests about manipulation. And so the suggestion is that when you hear claims that the reason that things are in dispute right now, that there are challenges, that there are beliefs that there's fraud or voter suppression, is because it's racial discrimination or it's racial advantage, resist. Don't put it in those categories. Step back and say, hey, wait a second. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I have no idea how I would go about proving that. But the one thing that we can say is, if it really is just partisan manipulation, that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen, and we should have a different systemic approach, which is national, federal elections run by federal standards, and not by who's in control in any given county, not by who's in control in any given state at any time. It's too important for that. Thank you very much. I'm told that nothing I said was comprehensible, so I have to answer questions now. Yes?
I think it's a great idea. How do you get the states to turn over that power to the Fed so that the Fed can set up who is administrative?
So the question is, if the states have exercised the power from the beginning to run elections, how are we going to get the Fed set the power? Well, it turns out we don't have to. It turns out it's right in the Constitution. The Constitution says Congress has the power over time, place, and manner of federal elections. So I want Congress to do exactly what they did with the census. The Constitution says Congress has to conduct a census. Congress conducts a census. The states can either go along with the congressional system of having a census, or they can pay for another one. And they're not going to pay for another one. And so what I'd like to see is Congress take the bull by the horns and just simply say, these are federal elections, this is how you run them. These are the standards. This is what counts as an ID. I personally wouldn't mind having a national ID in the United States. I know that's a controversial statement, but we use proxy national IDs. My driver's license or a passport or something, but I usually a driver's license. Why not give people a national ID? Then we don't have to worry about the citizenship question, about identity and all this. Now, I'm originally from Argentina, where everybody has an ID card, and voting is mandatory. Right? And you just go, you show your ID, there's never a problem on that score. But Congress has that power. What they don't have the power over under the Constitution is how to run local elections, state elections. But if they say that for federal elections, these will be the number of polling places per X number of citizens. In each congressional district, there will be this many, at least. And in each congressional district, this shall be the form of identification that's accepted, and so forth. That'll become the standard because it's just too burdensome, expensive, and absurd to have two different election systems. Yeah?
So much of what I hear a lot of people say, the approach these elections, they say, I'm voting for the lesser of two evils. And a lot of times you say that they're both wrong, so I'm not going to vote. And I see that as sort of a trend for why people are showing up in elections. One of the things I've heard about, and it makes a lot of sense, is instant runoff ballots. The Oscars switched to it a few years ago, and that's one thing I haven't heard.
And how have the movies been?
But anyways, I just wonder, I don't even know if that's a trend, if people are trying to push that through. I don't know, at least with the county elections, it seems like you have these small local elections trying that, and then if they catches on, other people would want that. But to me, that instant runoff says, you're not penalized for voting for Ralph Nader or Ron Paul or anybody like that because your preference. If they're not going to win, then you get your second vote. And I just wonder, you're more into it, you could address that.
Yeah, so the question is, what about alternative voting systems, what are sometimes called proportional systems, semi-proportional systems? The specific question was something called instant runoff voting, which you've probably done many times without realizing it. So, for example, some of you are from Marshall University. Most faculty senates use instant runoff voting for the selection of their senate. I don't know if Marshall does, but for example, Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is sort of in the United States, uses instant runoff voting. There's a number of jurisdictions that do it. Basically what it is you have 10 people, and 4 of them are going to get elected, and you say, I like this one first. I like this one second, third, fourth, fifth. And so there's a first run through, and the people who get the most votes, a certain number, there's a mathematical formula, it's actually quite complicated, they get on, and then there's a second run through. So the top are selected, and the bottoms are dropped out. And then the votes are reallocated based upon, my first one didn't get in, now my vote goes to my second one. And so you keep reassigning it until you get an election. And what that does is it allows for a broader range, but it also means that the most in-demand candidates win. So it has a nice mix. There's a big political theory dispute about these systems. So the basic divide is as follows. You have most democratic countries in the world use some form of proportional representation. So if the Greens get 13% of the vote in Germany, they get 13% of the seats in the Bundestag. And something, that's carried out across almost all democratic countries. The ones that come out of the English tradition tend to use single-member districts. Now, single-member districts reward only two parties for reasons that if you split out, you give the plurality winner will be the one furthest from you, not the one closest to you. So there's the accusation of Tweedledee and Tweedledum. That's always been through much of the 20th century. Oh, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the parties. You don't hear that so much anymore, I have to say. But you hear now there's $5 worth of difference. We don't like that either, right? Somewhere between a dime and $5, you probably get it about right. The problem with proportional representation is that you get a lot of fractionation. You get many, many parties into the legislature, into the parliament, and then they join together after the election. So I'm the party that's going to put soda pop in the water fountains, right? And I run on that, and everybody votes for me because they want soda pop in the water fountains. Election comes, I join the government, can't get soda pop, but I can get myself 2 ministries, so that's pretty good, and I'll just settle for that. Come the next election, I say, I fought as hard as I could for soda pop, and stay with me on the soda pop question. So you never have to run as the party of government, you just run as a party of what you're thinking about. And so there's a certain lack of accountability in proportional representation systems that we worry about. Political scientists debate this issue endlessly. In our system, because it rewards the party that can put together the biggest winning coalition, you create that coalition before the election rather than after the election. That's why the parties are closer, because they're centrist. And the question that you're raising is actually a very important one, which is, Brandeis said 100 years ago that the states can be laboratories of experimentation. Why not? Why not have local elections? And there are groups in the United States that push for different kinds of electoral systems. You could have, for example, instant runoff voting. All of our corporate boards in the United States are elected by cumulative voting, which is another of what's called semi-proportional system. There are school boards in many cities, including some in Texas, which I helped write draft legislation from, that are organized by something called limited voting. Limited voting, you don't create little districts, but you say if there's going to be 5 people on the school board, everybody here gets 3 votes, not 5 votes. What does that mean? That means the majority can't reproduce itself across all 5. So you get a mix-up. You get you can get people organized, and you can change the electoral outcomes. There's a stickiness in this, and there's a real problem. And the real problem is that the one thing that every elected official in the United States agrees about, Democrats and Republicans, 100%, the system that elected them to office is the best, wisest system that man has ever, or woman has ever designed. They all know that for sure. How do they know? They've run a natural experiment. Me against my opponent, and I won, right? So this is a good system. It's a smart system. You tend to have most experimentation in states where there's referendum, where the citizens can act directly to throw the bums out. And so we have more experimentation in California, for example, by referendum. They went over to something called the top 2 primary. And there are other issues short of that that could change things. So for example, I should have looked up, I don't know whether, is West Virginia closed primary or open primary? Open. Open primaries turn out to be more reflective of the population broadly than closed primaries. Closed primaries, you only get the party faithful. The problem with primaries is very few people vote. I mean, the numbers I gave, you'd never get 40% voting in a primary. It just never happens. And so you get real extreme activists. And if it's closed on top of that, then you get very polarizing candidates. So there's efforts at experimentation, there's a stickiness in the political process because of the incumbent control. Well, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Our next lecture will actually focus on history. We try to mix it up, public policy, politics, history. The next one is going to focus on Lincoln's second inaugural address, because 2015 is the 150th anniversary of that. And so I hope I will see you back, and I'd like you to join me in again thanking Professor Issacharoff.